So I'll start by introducing you. Welcome everybody to the Canadian Society for Ecology and Evolution's second PhD Research Excellence in Research Award talk. This is a series of 5 talks that usually are presented at the annual CSEE conference, but now will be presented online to the public by our amazing 5 winners. This week we have Anne McLeod, who will be talking about food webs and the case for space. I'm really excited to hear her break down this. But first to outline kind of the structure of it. So she'll give this talk at the end of it. You'll see kind of throughout the talk on the YouTube, there'll be a chat bar where you can type in any and all questions you have for Anne during the talk. And at the end of it, we'll have a live question period where I will take the questions and read as many of them as I can to her, and she'll be able to answer your questions live. And if you have any compliments or anything else, great talk or anything, feel free to add that as well. Applause is always welcome. So with that, I'll let Anne take it away. She can screen share or share her screen, and we'll get the slides up, and then we'll get going. Thanks everyone for tuning in.
Okay, thank you, Peter, for organizing all this. Seems like it's been a lot of work to make the transition from in-person to online. So like Peter said, I'm Anne. It feels weird presenting this without a co-author on this slide. So I want to take the chance to thank my supervisor, because none of this, I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for him, his support and his patience and his wisdom over the last 4 years. So my supervisor is Sean LaRue, and I'm part of the Ecosystem Ecology Lab at MUN. So to start with, what are food webs? Food webs describe community structure and the transfer of energy between species. So to get you oriented, I've put a simple depiction of a food web here. So you see there's the zooplankton that's being eaten by a fish, which is then being eaten by a bird. And you have arrows linking them, showing the flow of energy as you move up through these predatory interactions. It's important to study food webs because they're important for understanding ecosystem stability. And so we can think about ecosystem stability. Here I'm doing it in a simple omnivory module, which we'll come back to later in the talk. That's why I chose this one. So you have a bird that's eating a zooplankton and eating a fish. So the bird is competing with the fish for a resource that they're both sharing, but the bird is simultaneously eating the fish. And so we can look at the stability of these systems by making these biomass plots. So here we have on the y-axis, we have biomass, the max and min. And then we have anything along the x-axis. So for the purposes of this one, I chose the omnivore's preference for the resource. So as the omnivore preferentially consumes a zooplankton, what happens? And as the omnivore preferentially consumes the fish, what happens? And what you see at the beginning is you have this oscillatory behavior. And again, at the end in the zooplankton biomass, and in the middle, you sort of have a fixed point stability here. We can also look at food web persistence. So in this case, we have a region where all 3 species are persistent, and that's from this red line towards the 0. Because if you get above this red line, then the strength of the bird feeding on the zooplankton is too much, and you see an extinction of the fish species. So not all 3 species are persistent. We can also scale this up into larger food webs. And so this is a classic food web in literature. It's the Benguela food web off the coast of Africa. And it's was from a really important study in 1992 by Yotis and Innes. And part of this study was they looked at how, if they remove the biomass of South African fur seals, how the rest of the food web would respond to that. So it's sort of a key paper here. And so you can explore that kind of fisheries dynamics, or if you're in a terrestrial system, what happens when you remove one of the species within this food web. There's also a lot of research into the commonalities in food web, irrespective of the ecosystems. So this is a paper by Jennifer Dunn et al. In 2002, and they were showing that there's consistencies as you move from marine to aquatic to terrestrial systems, irrespective of the ecosystem, showing repeated structures and showing similarities. But this is sort of at a broader scale, what happens when we look at, when we focus in on local scale differences. So with this talk, I want to answer 4 major questions. The first one is, are these similarities that we see across space and across ecosystems, are they consistent for local food webs across gradients? So this one's a data chapter using data from Ontario lakes. Then if we focus in on omnivory, which I previously introduced, does its expression in empirical food webs imply something about the persistence or stability of communities? And is that in turn reflected in our models, especially as we go from these smaller 3-species food web models to these larger ones that are more accurate depictions of reality? So this chapter merges both data and some theory. Then I move mainly into theory and I look in a broader context, how well do these common structures, so these things that we see that are they repeated for a reason, or are they just sort of artifacts of community assemblage? Can we use them to predict network persistence? Can we use them to predict species persistence? And can we use them to predict interaction persistence? And finally, these middle two questions are ignoring space. So how can we integrate space back into these models, and how might integrating space change our predictions of food web persistence and stability? So to start with the first one, I was looking at how variable species interactions are across space. Then whether or not, if these species interactions are variable, can we explain them using biotic or abiotic mechanisms? And then if these interactions are changing, does it really matter that they're changing? Does it really matter that we're seeing the switch in interactions between different lakes across Ontario? Or are we really seeing that it's the players that are switching out, but the overall food web structure is staying consistent? So you might trade out your lake trout for a northern pike, but the overall structure of your food web is staying the same. So to answer these questions, we were using the broad scale monitoring data set, which is this great data set that the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources collected from 2008 to 2012. And so it's across 741 lakes, basically spans a really wide gradient of Ontario. From that, we took a subset of the most well-sampled lakes. So this left us with 129, which you can see on the inset here. So we still have a fairly representative swath of Ontario. So first, how do we measure the variability in species interactions across space? So one of the ways you can do this is using beta diversity metrics, but you just modify them to look at the change in interaction between two sites as opposed to the change in species between two sites. So we call those beta int, or turnover and interaction. This turnover and interaction can be divided into two key parts. So you have the part due to the rewiring of interactions, and you have the part due to the species turnover and interactions. So here, just to walk you through with a cartoon, in Lake 1 and Lake 2, we see that both species A and species D are present. In Lake 1, A interacts with D, and so A is actually consuming D. In Lake 2, A only interacts with D through an intermediary E. We also can see turnover interactions through species turnover. So again, in Lake 1, we have the species B, but that species isn't present in Lake 2. And so in Lake 2, A just can't consume B because B isn't there. The species turnover component can be broken down further into 4 other parts. So these are the part due to the top turnover in the top predators. So this would be A in this case, it's the top predator. So if A is swapping out and something else is swapping in, you can get turnover in the intermediate. So this would be the case for the B here, because the B is an intermediate species in Lake 1 and it's not present in Lake 2. Sorry. You can also have turnover in the basal species. So this would be C or D, that's what's at the base of the food web. Or you can have turnover in both species. So say there was a species G and a species H in Lake 2, and G and H were interacting, neither G or H is present in Lake 1, so you don't see them, the same interaction. And so what did we find? We found that there was a pretty high turnover across these lakes. When you think about Ontario lakes, or at least when I think about lakes in Ontario, I think about them being fairly similar, maybe some differences in species, but likely what you're eating in one lake is probably going to be similar to what you're eating in another lake. And actually what we saw was of quite high turnover and interaction. When you break this down, it was mainly due to species turnover, as you would imagine. And then when you break the species turnover down further, you see that it's mainly because of the turnover in the basal species. And so that was quite surprising to me because I don't think about basal species switching a lot between lakes, but I guess here the basal species were still fish. And so I guess you could have a wide diversity of forage fish in these, and minnows and stuff like that in these lakes. But very interesting was the fact that there was still a high component of rewiring. And so we often think about fish swimming around and eating just whatever it comes across. And this suggests that potentially that's not the case, that fish are actually choosing more than you might expect. So we know that these interactions are changing, so can we explain why these interactions are changing? Can we pinpoint a mechanism for these changes? So to focus on the abiotic mechanisms, you can come up with different hypotheses for why different abiotic mechanisms might drive these things. So if we take depth, maybe in lake 2 is much deeper than lake 1. And so you actually just get a separation in space between A and D. And so A can't consume D because it prefers a different habitat than in lake 1. So we looked at all of these different abiotic mechanisms that we had for all of these lakes. So the latitude, area, mean depth, pH, morphodaphic index, which is a proxy for the productivity of the lake, degree days over 5, and species richness, which isn't really abiotic, but we lumped it in there anyway. And what we saw was that spatial interaction turnover was actually unrelated to abiotic gradients to any real extent. So the environmental components of these aren't really driving it. So what about the biotic components? I was really excited for the biotic components. So here, there's been a lot of research that's shown that we can predict interaction structure within food webs using traits. So I did an extensive review looking at different traits for different fish and coming up with a mapping mechanism to predict these interactions. So if we start, the simplest one to envision is abundance. And so this is sort of just a neutral theory. If A and D are super abundant in lake 1, the probability of them interacting is higher. So the likelihood that they will interact and that you'll observe this interaction is higher. In lake 2, on the other hand, the population of D is quite low and also A. And so you just have a lower probability of interacting. So we looked at 5 different traits, abundance as like a pseudo trait. So phylogenetic relatedness, competition, thermotolerance, and morphology. And these were things that the literature had shown had been successful in other systems. And then you can look at the interactions between all of these. And what we found was that species traits were not effective predictors of lake-specific interaction networks. So at this scale, we couldn't predict the food webs with any degree of accuracy. And actually, in some of the cases, random was fit better than the traits that I'd spent a long time in the literature looking for. So that was very encouraging for me. But we had the last question. So the last question was, how important are these changes to overall food web structure? So the interactions are changing, but does that matter? Are we just swapping out the players and we're maintaining the same overall food web architecture? So one of the ways you can do this is by looking at the frequency that each species has in these 3 species motifs. So there's 13 different ways that you can combine 3 species and their interactions. And within each of these 13 different ways, you have unique species positions within them. And so you can map out each species within these motifs or modules, whatever you'd like to call them. So again, a cartoon from this one, if we look at species A, we see that it is actually in those 4 and in lake 1, but only in 2 of them in lake 2. So what did we see? We saw that despite this high spatial turnover interactions, the species roles were highly conserved. So things were changing, but it didn't really matter for the overall structure of the food webs. So we see these repeated structures within these food webs. Does this mean anything? Is this important for the persistence or the stability of the food webs? And so from here, I'm going to focus in on one of these, which is omnivory. So I'm going to move into how important is omnivory. One of these things that we do see overexpressed in some food webs, how important is that for communities? This might seem like omnivory is a very, very well studied thing, but when you actually look into it, there's a lot of discrepancy in the definition of an omnivore. So lots of studies have looked at it, but they've looked at it using sort of a different nuanced definition of omnivory. So here we see a simple omnivory module. We see the omnivore in white, we see a consumer in gray, and we see the resource in blue. And so you see, again, the omnivore is competing with the consumer for the resource, but also eating consuming the consumer. And so this is one definition of omnivory, where this blue species has to be the basal level of the food web, so you have to be competing for a primary producer or an autotroph. Another definition of omnivory is just the omnivore has to feed on 2 distinct trophic levels. And so in that definition, you don't even get competition at this lower level. And when you go into the literature, you see that there's an omnivory stability debate. And part of that is because people are using different definitions of omnivory between empirical studies and theoretical studies. So if we think about a food web, we can come up with a bunch of different types of omnivory and a bunch of different omnivory modules. So first we see the classic one where it's rooted in the basal level and we have competition between the consumer and the omnivore. We can also move that same sort of motif, we can put it upwards in the food web. And so now instead of competing for a resource, they're consuming a secondary consumer or some sort of heterotroph. Next, we can see we have the case where the omnivore and consumer aren't actually competing for the same resource. So the omnivore is still feeding on two separate trophic levels. It's still feeding on a basal trophic level, but there's no competition between the consumer and the resource for this. And then we have another case, which is quite unique, where we actually have two omnivores. And so the consumer is consuming the resource, but it's still also consuming the other omnivore. And so this is mutual predation between the two. And then lastly, we have cannibalism, which is a really unique one because your omnivore and your consumer are the same organism. And your omnivore resource interaction is also your consumer resource interaction. So it's a very special one of them. And so when you look at the anatomy of an omnivory module, you see that there's three different things. So there's the overall whole omnivory module, there's the omnivore, and there's the omnivore resource interaction. And like I was saying, when you look at empirical studies and theoretical studies, they're looking at the expression of these different components of these within food webs, and they're drawing conclusions and they're comparing to studies that are using a different metric. And so if we count omnivores, we can come up with one number. If we count the omnivore resource interaction, we can come up with a different one. And if we come up with if we count the omnivory module, we can come up with yet another number. So I've highlighted this here. You can see that here there's actually one omnivore resource interaction, but there's three omnivory modules and only one omnivore. If we look over here, we actually see that there's three omnivore resource interactions and only one omnivore. And then a bunch of omnivory modules. And so calculating these, measuring these things in the same way is very important. And also theory suggests that it's the omnivore resource interaction that's stabilizing. And so maybe counting the number of omnivores or counting the number of omnivore modules isn't as important as counting the number of omnivore resource interactions. So is the omnivore resource interaction truly stabilizing? And a lot of this research has been done at a 3 species or 4 species module level. So do these module level theoretical results scale once you incorporate a dynamic 50 species food web model? And do these results scale to predictions of persistence? So as we move from this simpler food web to this more complex food web. So this chapter had 3 major objectives, not objections. I wanted to explore the prevalence of omnivory and empirical food webs. So both looking at the module expression and the omnivore resource interaction expression for each type of omnivory. And the idea is that if these things are important, then you should see them being overexpressed than your null models. And if they're not important or they're actually detrimental for persistence, you'll see them being underexpressed in empirical webs. And then you can contrast that with the theoretical results. And so what I found was that there was differential expression of omnivory modules and omnivore resource interactions within the empirical food webs across these 5 different types. So across the 5 different food webs that I looked at, so these were real food webs that we had pulled from the literature, including the Benguela food web that I'd showed previously, but then some other ones. Across different ecosystems, we see differential expression. And so this suggests that not all omnivore resource interactions may act as keystone interactions. And so when we sort of say that, oh, the omnivores are stabilizing for these food webs, or we want to preserve omnivores or stuff like that, there might not be that much evidence to support that. So we know that from an empirical standpoint, but what about from a theoretical standpoint? Does the omnivore resource interaction still have the same impact on persistence across these 5 different omnivory modules? And to bring you back to these sort of biomass omnivore preference for resource graphs that I brought up earlier, this one's just the exact same as the one I showed at the beginning. So again, we have biomass max and min along the y-axis. We have the omnivore's preference for resource along the x-axis, and we have our 3 different species. We see that the area of persistence is when the omnivore has a weak preference for the resource. And so if we compare that to a different omnivory module, here I'm comparing it to the multi-resource omnivory module, we see that actually, no, there's not the same impact on persistence. Actually, the omnivory or the multi-resource omnivory is more persistent at high interaction strengths and at low interaction strengths. So essentially what's happening here is that when you have a high preference for this resource, you're developing two consumer resource chains because this interaction here becomes quite weak. So it's perhaps not unsurprising, but it's still an interesting result. So then how do these conclusions scale to whole food web persistence? Is omnivory still a keystone interaction stabilizing whole food web? So within the whole food web, you have these different pressures of other organisms, other consumers, and other resources that you might be consuming. So do we still see this major take home of the omnivore resource interaction being stabilizing? So here, this is the contribution to food web persistence along the y-axis and the module frequency along the x-axis. We have classic omnivory, mutual predation, multi-resource, trophic omnivory, and then the special case of cannibalism. And we actually see that multi-resource omnivory, perhaps unsurprising from the module level results, contributes the most to food web persistence. And there's a very weak effect of classic omnivory on whole food web persistence. These results are really important because we often highlight that there's inconsistencies between empirical data and theory, and we often talk about how we need to bridge this data and theory divide. But here we have inconsistencies between theory at one scale and theory at a different scale. So theory at a module level and theory at the whole food web level. And we sort of need to start thinking about how to bridge those scales as well. Even though obviously modeling the 50 species, these dynamic 50 species food web models is a lot more complex. We still need to sort of figure out how to really tackle that. But that was just one of these many structures that are repeated within these food webs and have been shown to be repeated in these food webs. And so that was just this one, which is conveniently called M38. So that's the omnivory module here. But we actually have 13 of these 3 species motifs. And literature has shown that these motifs are over or underexpressed in food webs with predictable patterns. So what happens when we expand and we look at these other modules? Perhaps some of the rarer modules in nature, or these rarer motifs, might be more important for stabilizing the interactions. And are these structures actually important, or are they actually just artifacts of community assembly or some other factors, or can they predict the persistence of communities? So here with the next level, I was looking at whether we can use network metrics to predict persistence of food webs at the network level. At the species level. So how likely is this whole food web going to persist? How can we use these metrics to predict whether or not this individual species persists, and then whether or not this interaction persists? So can we use, at the species level, this could be contribute to conservation efforts. So maybe there's a network level thing that distills down for the species persistence. So here I pitted some things against each other that have been shown in the literature to be important for network persistence. So this includes interaction strength, modularity, and then this multi-resource omnivory that I'd shown in the previous chapter. And then these 3 species motifs. And the interesting thing, or the cool thing about these motifs is that you can look at them as a 3 species motif, but then you can also look at them as a species position sort of thing. And then you can also look at them as the interaction. And so that's how we can get to the interaction level persistence and the species level persistence, by describing this interaction as its placement within the broader food web as a whole. So at the network level, we saw that modularity, multi-resource omnivory, and omnivory all, like the classic and trophic omnivory, all contributed positively to network persistence. And these 2 types of competition, apparent and exploitative competition, contributed negatively. The rest didn't really show any strong patterns. But when we look at the species and the interaction level, we actually see no significant predictors of species or interaction level persistence, which suggests that network-based metrics cannot help us to conserve specific species or interactions. But these interaction, or these motifs come in these food webs, but these food webs, we're ignoring an important component of these food webs, because these food webs are actually not closed environments. And so when we're taking the data from the environment, we're taking it and then assuming that it's now in this black box, like nothing's going on outside, nothing's coming into it, nothing's going out of it. And that's not actually the case in the environment. So what happens when we incorporate space? So if we think about a river food web here, We might have this being the overall full river food web, and we might use this to examine stability of the system. And we say, oh, based on this configuration, these species aren't going to persist. But when we actually go out into the stream, we see that it's actually two food webs, one up at the deciduous area, one down in the coniferous area. And the stabilizing thing is the movement of this species back and forth. And so when we ignore the ability of this species to move between the two food webs, we're making false predictions about the persistence of these food webs. And we're altering landscapes at unprecedented rates. So this becomes more than just an esoteric concern. So we can think about damming, the damming that we're doing in aquatic systems, or we can think about these agricultural mosaics that we used to see when we could fly in planes. And the farmers' fields and the roads and the things that are put there that prevent species potentially from moving between these forested fragments. So how can we introduce space into our food web models? And then how in turn does this incorporation impact food web stability? So here you can think about it sort of like meta communities where you have these three lakes. And I should say that I use aquatic systems as my examples, but again, most of this is theory, so it doesn't need to be an aquatic or a terrestrial system. It's sort of just an abstract system. So if we think about, we have three lakes, and we have a simple tritrophic food chain between the three lakes. So we have this zooplankton, same zooplankton present in this lake, and same zooplankton species present in this lake, same for the fish and the bird. We can imagine that they can move between these patches, and their ability to move, or whether or not they they can disperse between the patches, is dependent really on their movement ability. And so we have these dispersal kernels where the bird is a bird, it's big, it can fly, so it has a really good, strong movement ability, and it can disperse between all three of the patches. The fish, on the other hand, maybe it's smaller and it can't move as well. And then the zooplankton can't move at all because it's just a passive disperser. And so you can model this system using the interplay between the connectivity of these patches on the landscape and their movement ability. But this is ignoring some of the perspective of the species. And so if you think about a fish, these two patches are close together. So in theory, these two patches should be connected with our model. But when we look at the landscape, we see that even though these two patches are further apart, we have a river, and the river is actually really important for the fish to be able to link these two patches. Likewise, for the zooplankton might be a passive disperser, but the zooplankton can be carried by prevalent wind patterns between two lakes that are close together. And also they can be carried downstream. And so you have a unidirectional or an asymmetric dispersal connectivity between these two patches. Likewise, for the bird doesn't really see any of these things because the bird is just flying. So for the bird, all these three patches are basically the same and connected in the same way. So with this, you sort of need to think about the species characteristics, but also the landscape characteristics. So the landscape characteristics being the physical flow and the landscape structure. And what happens is when you don't consider these things, so if we go back to this simple example, if we were just using this sort of classic assumption that your ability to move between patches is based solely on your movement ability, you would see this pattern for the bird, you would see the fish actually moving between two lakes that are not connected by aquatic systems. And then you'd see the zooplankton not being able to move between any of them. But when you think about it, the movement being the combination of the species and the landscape, you actually see a different view. And so you see this asymmetric dispersal of the zooplankton, and you see the fish being able to move back and forth using this river corridor. So what does this mean for patch stability? How does this change our model predictions? So here I used a tritrophic food chain with a predator, a consumer, and a resource. This is sort of the true or the platonic view of how these lakes are connected. Used a simple Rosenwig-MacArthur consumer resource model that I'm not going to get into, but it's been studied a lot before. And we can do the same sort of biomass plots. This time is on the x-axis, and we can see that in patch 1, the biomass of the resource, the biomass of the consumer, and the biomass of the predator are all stable across all three patches and actually all identical. And what happens when you take the viewpoint of the consumer and the resource seeing the patches being displayed like this, and the predator actually only having a connection between patch 1 and patch 2? How does that change your predictions? So now we actually see that we develop these oscillatory behaviors across all three of the species, pretty wild oscillations for this consumer in patch 3, which is now demonstrating different dynamics than the other two patches, and also a lower resource biomass at both the peak and the trough of its oscillations compared to previously when it was at around 2. So what does this mean for patch stability? We see a decrease in overall resource biomass, and we see a shift from point stability to oscillating dynamics. And so this is often the view that comes to mind. We often think about implementing this into habitat fragmentation and connectivity between patches and habitat corridors. But I think you also need to start thinking about this in terms of these bigger food webs that we've been collecting, and these classic food webs that are used a lot across a lot of food web studies and in a lot of these more classic food web studies. So as we recall, this is the Benguela system, and to put it into context, it was collected off the coast of South Africa, and it's actually from this Benguela current. And the original study was looking at how if you harvested the fur seals, how would the rest of the populations rebound? But when you think about this being a food web off the coast of South Africa in a current, you realize that this is not a closed food web, and this food web is actually from multiple time points and across multiple spatial scales. So the whales and dolphins might be only migrating in for 1 week of the year and then migrating away. And so they're not actually that dependent on the biomass of their prey in this system. They're actually more dependent on the biomass of their prey in a system that might be much further away from them. And then we also look at things like the phytoplankton, which is at the bottom of the food web here. And there's been a lot of literature that suggests that lumping phytoplankton, all the phytoplankton species, into one broad category for these food webs is wrong or not appropriate. But beyond that, you think about the phytoplankton, you think that there's probably one population of a species of phytoplankton living up here, and another population of the same species of phytoplankton living down here. And those phytoplankton actually aren't competing or sharing resources or anything, but when we take this view of the food web, we're imposing this sort of static nature to it. Because organisms experience their environments at vastly different scales. But within food web studies, we arbitrarily assign the scale of interaction, usually by landscape attributes. So whether it's a lake or a forest fragment or this current off the coast of South Africa. And if two species don't actually share the same habitat, are they still competing for the same resources? And does it still make sense to view them in this sort of light? So if we go back to this stream ecosystem, this cartoon of a stream ecosystem that we saw earlier, this might have been the food web that we saw when we went out and sampled, but when we take a closer look, we see that there's actually a skeleton of that food web that's present in the deciduous section up here, and a larger fragment of that food web that's present in this coniferous section down here. And by just thinking about the system as a homogeneous food web that looks like this is actually not doing the ecology justice. Food webs are made of ephemeral interactions that are linked through both space, but also time. And so I've focused on space, but I think time is a really important component of this as well. And maybe we need to shift our thinking of food webs from this larger static nature of these complex food webs into smaller subwebs linked through microspace or smaller habitat use. So this comes back to my title, The Case for Space. So from my first chapter, I showed that the results demonstrate an important distinction between food web model prediction capabilities at regional and local extents. And so I was using trait-based predictors, which have been shown for the broader, more regional food webs to be really good predictors of whether or not two species are going to interact. But when you actually look at the local level and these individual lakes, you don't see that it works as well. And I think we need to start thinking about all of the things that are going on within these local levels and how different things might be more important at those levels. But also when we're attempting to apply module level results to regional webs. So here we think about omnivory and applying omnivory to this broad food web. Maybe that doesn't really make sense, but actually when you think about this food web as being broken down within space and time, maybe it does make sense because you do see these smaller omnivory modules that are linked. But it's the same thing when we're trying to compare the regional web results from the empirical data and applying those to the whole food web dynamic models, because we're assuming that we're seeing these repeated structures within this static template. But then when we apply them within this sort of static template here, we don't see that they're important and we see different effects. And so we sort of need to start thinking about that when we're moving between these two scales as well. And perhaps we need to start thinking about our food webs more as this, where it's the same food web, though this dashed red line is still a feeding interaction, but it's actually a feeding interaction separated along the space axis or along the time component. And so now you see that you actually do have these disparate module level results connected through space and time. So this presentation and my thesis has been a lot of work, obviously, but also would not have been completed without the help of all of these people, the conversations with my friends, my family, the biology group at MUN, but also all of the other universities where I went and spent some time, and Sean, obviously, and Cindy in the broad scale monitoring team. If you guys have any questions that you're too scared to ask in the YouTube environment, you can email me. This is my email address, and thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Anne. That was an incredibly cool talk. An incredibly cool case for space and using food webs. As a reminder, everybody tuning in, you can type your questions to Anne in the live chat and I'll ask them to her now. I did have one question, Anne. I was wondering, you kind of touched on this already, but I was kind of wondering more about that kind of temporal aspect, especially in lakes. Like often you have really clear separations between like winter lakes or the ecosystems in winter lakes versus summer lakes, and then of course spring and fall as well.
Yeah, I think the temporal aspect, particularly because I think in systems that have more seasonal dynamics, I think the temporal aspect is really neat because in lakes you see shifts in their diet as they move from the winter when you have ice cover to the summer where you don't have ice cover. And so you see actually more than just a temporal, like that temporal shift, I think you see a homogenizing of the lake because you're losing your thermocline when you have the ice cover is sort of, so if you think about being a lake trout, so you're a cold water predator, in the winter, like the world's your oyster, right? So you can consume everything. And so there might be an artifact of that within the broad scale monitoring data where we're capturing lakes at different points throughout the seasonality of the summer. But yeah, I think that's a really key thing and within the Benguela as well, because you're seeing the migration of these larger species. What would be really cool is if you could go back to these classic food webs and sort of dissect them in that same vein. So take Benguela and say, oh, you know, for 2 weeks, this is what you see. In the next 2 weeks, this is what you see. The next 2 weeks is. But when you look at so I spent a long time looking at the sources for these like classic webs. So there's some that just get used more and more frequently in the literature. And when you try and see the sources, so for Benguela, the source is actually conference proceedings from a conference in like 1980 something. And there's no or expert knowledge or conversation with a friend or like those kinds of things. And so to piece back together, when do you actually see this interaction becomes a lot of work. But I think it's critical. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. One question in, someone is wondering, how would you deal with the spatial aspect? How you would deal with the spatial aspect could be applied to continuous space as opposed to more discrete space.
So I don't, this is something I thought about recently. It's not a fully formed idea, but I sort of have this idea about taking, if you think about space and time together, I think you can keep, because space being discrete makes things much simpler from a modeling aspect. And I think if you can keep space and time both sort of as discrete, but layer them on together. And I think if you layered them on together from a species level, as opposed to from a whole food web level, you could sort of keep it being discretized, but approximate, approximate continuous. So yeah, but I don't know if that would work, but like you can take the multi-layer network approaches and you can use, so there's a lot of right now multi-layer networks are like a very hot topic. And so there's a lot of physics approaches using some cool mathematical techniques to look at these. And I think if you think about food webs as being multi-layer networks, not from the perspective of an antagonistic interaction and a mutualistic interaction, but rather from an antagonistic interaction on one space plane and an antagonistic interaction on a temporal plane, I think you can approximate that continuity. But again, that's like I've just started thinking about this, so I don't know.
That's awesome.
But I think it's a tricky thing when thinking about space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, thanks for giving us that inside look into these potential future avenues. Yeah. Another question coming in wondering, do you think it would be possible to look at the spatial dimension in a fine scale way? For example, different layers of a lake or ocean having different populations of zooplankton, fish, etc.
Yeah, so I think there's two aspects to this. So within my first chapter where I was looking across the lakes and I found that traits weren't very good predictors within the lake, I think part of that reason is that we were looking traits alone and we weren't looking at traits times the environment. And so we were kind of getting at the environment with things like the thermal profile, which I thought was going to sort of show those more like smaller space use within the lakes. It didn't to the same extent, but I think you need to, and there was a 2019 paper, I want to say by Jofford et al., where they did do a trait times environment look at local food web interactions. And so I think that for predicting interactions, that is a really good way of doing it. From the modeling standpoint, I think it's easier to do because I think you just start smaller and you build them and connect them. And I think we developed sort of a framework for looking at species-specific connectivity across space. And I think that would be something that could be pulled in to look at it from a modeling perspective for the lakes and the ocean. Did that answer the question? I don't know.
I think so. It seemed to me. Yeah, thank you. I'll ask you one more. What about parsing out community interactions within longitudinal space, such as stream system that gradually changes over time over river mile versus discrete lakes?
Yeah, that's more of a sampling thing, which is obviously not something I spend that much time doing. But I think be it a stream or be it a lake, I think you still see the same sort of gradient of interactions. Like gradient of interactions within a lake when you move up your depth profile, or the gradient interactions over a longitudinal study of a stream. I think you see the same things, or it's the same sort of challenges that you don't have one, like, so in my depiction of the stream, I showed that the deciduous section had one food web and the coniferous section had a different food web. And in reality, yeah, it's sort of a gradient between the two. But I think when you take the species specific connectivity perspective of the species characteristics and the landscape characteristics, and you interplay them, then you can sort of get at that gradient better within both the models and the empirical data. From the empirical data standpoint, I think the major challenge is sampling that lake, right? Because food web sampling is so intensive, and that's part of the reason why we have these, why food webs are sort of more of a meta web from like expert knowledge, observed interactions in the lab, like all of these different things interplay together, and that's how they develop their food webs. So to do that kind of fine scale thing within a river would be super neat and could answer, I think, a lot of questions, but you would have to go out there, sample, do the gut contents at each place that you decided to discretize your stream at, and also temporally. And then the effort to do that, again, as somebody that doesn't go out and do these things per se, the effort to do that seems quite a lot. And the knowledge, because that's the other thing, is that you're using these gut content analysis, and maybe a lot of it is actually coming from the resource level where you need this extreme expert knowledge to identify zooplankton or phytoplankton, even from a gut content to attack, like to a species level or even to a genus level, right? Like that's a skill set that not everyone has. Yeah. that I definitely don't.
The struggles of theoretical biologists.
Yeah.
I might cheat and ask one more question because I'm always curious when it comes to these food webs, how do you deal with species that have like different life stages and occupy different kind of roles in the food web at different life stages?
Yeah, so that is something that I think sometimes when we think about food webs, we sort of put blinders on and we say like, there's other things going on, but we can't look at them because it's too complicated. There's too many things. And I think that is one of the things that we definitely need to look at more, both from the actual real world descriptions of our food webs, but also from the modeling perspective of it too. So when I was doing the 50 species food webs, I was just sort of assuming like this node is a node and it's not, there's no ontogenetic shifts. You can do that through life stage movements. So you model the first life stage and then you model the second life stage. And again, you're chopping up what could be a continuous thing for something that's just growing and changing you're making it into discrete stages and saying that there's like a fine boundary between the two. So typically people use that for things that undergo like metamorphic change where there's clear boundaries to that. But from a going out and collecting the data perspective, you still have the same problem. And when you're sort of overlaying them all and figuring out what your community structure looks like. So ways that people get at that is by lumping into like, this fish is under 100 grams. And this one is the same species, but it's over 100, between 100 grams and 200 grams or whatever. And they go up through that. But again, the sampling that's required in these lakes where you want to get, right, like you can't just get 10 northern pike or something like that. Like you want to get a sizable amount of them to really get an idea of what the population is doing. And so then you need to subset that into juvenile life stage, intermediate, but yes, it's something, because you see omnivory in particular, you see that in a static, when you've just overlaid it all together, you see that there's an omnivory loop, but actually maybe it's just the juvenile that's eating the resource and the adult is eating the consumer. And so you don't actually, it plays out differently. And so there's definitely that level of it as well. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much. The previous two questions, the people who asked them said, very cool, thank you, great answer, thank you. So you answered those questions terrifically well. Terrific job on the talk. It was excellent and great job answering the questions. So many of these comments in the live chat are applause, great job, amazing talk. So on behalf of all the CSEE, I'd like to thank you again for giving this talk. Congratulations on the award.
Thank you.
To those of you tuning in, thank you so much for watching and your very nice comments and great questions. And hopefully I'll see you all next week as well for our third PhD award talk.
Thank you. And thank you for organizing this all.
Thank you. Thank you.